Hi boys and girls, we're going to be continuing our read aloud this week of Stuart Little, but before we start chapter 5, I just want to recap everything we learned last week about the book. So we learned that Stuart is a mouse who lives with a human family called the Littles, and there's Mr. and Mrs. Little and their son George, and George is a human boy, and that would be Stuart's brother, and they have a pet cat named Snowbell, and they live in New York City. And seeing that Stuart is a mouse and he lives with a human family, there are certain things that are great about that because he gets to do all the small tasks that humans can't do. But there's also a lot of challenges for Stuart because he's not a human. Things just are really hard that are really easy for humans, like getting in a wash basin or turning on a light. So when we last left off in chapter 4, Stuart the mouse and Snowbell the cat were having a conversation about how firm their stomach muscles were, which are your ab muscles that are right here. And they were talking about how firm their muscles were. And Stuart was trying to show Snowbell that he had very strong muscles when an unfortunate thing happened. He got rolled up inside a shade of a window. And Snowbell took his cane and his hat and placed it by the mouse hole and left it there. And that was your last question you had to answer. And a lot of you did respond that you thought that Snowbell did that so that the Littles would think that Stuart went down the mouse hole. And if you got that, that's great inferencing. Why she did that? Maybe she doesn't like Stuart. Maybe she is angry because we know that she did say in her last line of the text, like, that would teach him to brag about his muscles. So we're going to begin chapter 5 today, and it's called Rescued. So we're going to find out what happens to Stuart from this point on. George was in favor of ripping up the pantry floor. He ran, got his hammer, his screwdriver, and an ice pick. I'll have this old floor up in double quick time, he said, inserting his screwdriver under the edge of the first board and giving a good vigorous pry. We will not rip up this floor till we have had a good search, announced Mr. Little. That's final, George. You can put that hammer away where you got it. Oh, all right, said George. I see that nobody in this house cares anything about Stuart but me. Mrs. Little began to cry. My poor dear little son, she said. I know he'll just get wedged somewhere. Just because you can't travel comfortably in a mouse hole doesn't mean that it isn't a perfectly suitable place for Stuart, said Mr. Little. Just don't get yourself all worked up. Maybe we ought to lower some food for him, suggested George. That's what the state police did when a man got stuck in a cave. George darted into the kitchen and came running back with a dish of applesauce. We can pour some of this in, and it will run down to where he is. George spooned out a bit of applesauce and started to poke it into the hole. Stop that, bellowed Mr. Little. George, will you kindly let me handle the situation? Put the applesauce away immediately. Mr. Little glared fiercely at George. I was just trying to help my own brother, said George, shaking his head as he carried the sauce back to the kitchen. Let's call to Stuart, suggested Mrs. Little. It is quite possible that the mouse hole branches and twists about and that he has lost his way. Very well, said Mr. Little. I will count to 3, and then we will all call. Then we will all keep perfectly quiet for 3 seconds, listening for the answer. He took out his watch. Mr. and Mrs. Little and George got down on their hands and knees and put their mouths as close as possible to the mouse hole, and they called, Stuart! And then they kept perfectly still for 3 seconds. Stuart, from his cramped position inside the rolled-up shade, heard them yelling in the pantry and called back, Here I am. But he had such a weak voice and was so far inside the shade that the other members of the family did not hear his answering cry. Again, said Mr. Little. 1, 2, 3, Stuart! It was no use. No answer was heard. Mrs. Little went up to her bedroom, lay down, and sobbed. Mr. Little went to the telephone and called up the Bureau of Missing Persons, but when the man asked for a description of Stuart and was told that he was only 2 inches high, he hung up in disgust, because that's not normal, right? We don't call for missing persons normally for a mouse. So the police was like, what are you doing? George, meantime, went down to the cellar and hunted around to see if he could find the other entrance to the mouse hole. So here's a picture of them crouched down in their kitchen trying to yell for Stuart. He moved George, this is George again. George moved a great many trunks, suitcases, flower pots, baskets, boxes, and broken chairs from one end of the cellar to the other in order to get at the section of the wall in which he thought was the likeliest, but found no hole. He did, however, come across an old discarded rowing machine of Mr. Little's, and becoming interested in it, carried it upstairs with some difficulty and spent the rest of the morning rowing. And there he is, rowing. There's George, rowing away on the rowing machine. When lunchtime came, everybody had forgotten about breakfast. All three sat down to a lamb stew, which Mrs. Little had prepared, but it was a sad meal. Each one was trying not to stare at the small empty chair which Stuart always occupied, right next to Mrs. Little's glass of water. No one could eat, so great was the sorrow. George ate a bit of dessert, but nothing else. When lunch was over, Mrs. Little broke out crying again, and she said she thought Stuart must be dead. Nonsense, nonsense, growled Mr. Little. If he is dead, said George, we ought to pull down the shades all through the house. And he raced to the windows and began pulling down the shades. George, shouted Mr. Little in an exasperated tone, if you don't stop acting in an idiotic fashion, I will have to punish you. We are having enough trouble today without having to cope with your foolishness. But George had already run into the living room and had begun to darken it to show his respect for the dead. He pulled the cord, and out dropped Stuart onto the windowsill. Well, for the love of Pete, said George, look who's here, Mom. It's about time somebody pulled down that shade, remarked Stuart. That's all I can say. He was quiet and weak and hungry. Mrs. Little was so overjoyed to see him that she kept right on crying. Of course, everybody wanted to know what would happen. It was simply an accident that might happen to anyone, said Stuart. As for my hat and cane being found at the entrance to the mouse hole, you can draw your own conclusions. And that is how Stuart was rescued. That's the end of chapter 5. So now he's back with the Littles.